Hey guys, so today is my first video in a while. Things have just been a little bit hectic, really busy, and not much time unfortunately for doing videos, which I really want to change going forward, because of course I enjoy doing videos, and yeah, just with the world being what it is right now, that's been a little bit tough. Before I jump into the Iron Heel, which is going to be the topic of today's video, I'm going to do a quick reading update just because I enjoy doing them. I'm not going to ramble about the books I read. I just feel like sharing what I've been reading towards the end of January and the first bit of February. So the first book after I finished Guardians of the Keep by Carol Berg, which is book 2 of her Bridge of Darnath series, I kind of felt like I needed a little bit of a break to recuperate myself, or at least calm myself down a little bit after finishing that book. So I thought it was a great time to finish the last 2 books I needed to reread in the Forgotten Realms Drizzt series before I started the newer books, to me anyways. So the last 2 books I had to do were the last 2 ones of the Sellsword series. So the first one being Promise of the Witch King, which I really like this cover, close up. But yeah, so here we've got Artemis Entreri. The focus is on Artemis Entreri and Jarl Axel of Brigandarthe, the Drow mercenary band that we've seen in past Drizzt books. Anyway, these guys have gone over to the Bloodstone lands as mercenaries for hire. I guess that's the only kind of mercenary, but yeah, this one was a really fun adventure. Lots of necromancy, liches, all sorts of fun monsters, and the story itself quite fun too. So I had fun with that. It was definitely my favorite of these 2. This one also had a great cover. I think these are among my favorites in this overall series. But yeah, the second one being Road of the Patriarch. I didn't like it as much as Promise of the Witch King, but it was still a lot of fun. We've got, again, Artemis and Jarl Axel up to their usual or their new shenanigans. And yeah, it was a nice break with these 2, I have to admit. It's always nice to have a little bit of adventure, fun in between somewhat more serious books, or books that bring up strong feelings, I should say. And so now, today, after I finished Road of the Patriarch, I'm diving back into Bridge of Darnath with the Soul Weaver, which is the 3rd book in this series. Alright, so without further ado, I'll jump into the topic of today's video, The Iron Heel by Jack London. And this is going to be the first video of 2 videos that I'm hoping to do of this type. It's basically, I'm basically wanting to look at 2 books that I read in 2020 that were pretty impactful for me, that really stuck with me, despite the fact, and I say despite kind of in air quotes, I guess, that I rated them under 4 stars. I think part of my motivation for doing this video, as well as the second video that I'm going to do on Mary Shelley's The Last Man, is mostly because I notice in a lot of online book communities that when people rate things under 4 stars, or see things on Goodreads or wherever that are rated under 4 stars, they tend to interpret those books or perceive those books as books that don't have as much value, or books that are not necessarily impactful or stick with you for a while, or make you think, are interesting, or otherwise, like I said, have a higher value. This book does definitely have a lot of value for me. Like I said, it stuck with me for a while after reading it. I continued to think about some of the points that it brought up throughout the year. But I rated it 3.75 out of 5 stars, and I'm going to tell you why later on in this video. And similarly with The Last Man by Mary Shelley, I actually really enjoyed that book. Again, it stuck with me, and I'll talk about that in the next video that I'm going to do on that. But yeah. The Iron Heel is a book that I read in early 2020, I think May or thereabouts, I can't quite remember, and I rated it 3.75 out of 5 stars. But even though that was a under 4-star rating, it's a book that was very impactful for me and very interesting read for me. To give a little bit of background on The Iron Heel, it was written by Jack London, of course, of White Fang and Call of the Wild fame, and published in 1908. I personally consider this work to be the first modern dystopian fiction novel. There are definitely, and I've heard people give this argument, so I just want to acknowledge there are definitely dystopian fictional works written before 1908, before the publication of this book. For example, only a few years earlier, H.G. Wells had written his famous Time Machine, which is, of course, a dystopian story with similar political leanings as The Iron Heel, actually, since Wells was also a socialist like Jack London. There are also many dystopian works that precede even The Time Machine, but I would say that The Iron Heel, for me, is the earliest work of dystopian lit that I know of that deals explicitly with themes that became staples of 20th century dystopian fiction that were eventually popularized by 1984. For example, The Iron Heel is the earliest one that I know of that deals specifically with the modern surveillance state being used to control and oppress its population. So that's a theme that we see a lot now. It's also one of the earliest works that I know of dealing specifically with the question of a modern oppressive political class or government within the context of a modern Western democracy. And to that point, Orwell himself considered The Iron Heel to be a major influence on his own writing, 1984. More specifically, since, of course, Orwell also wrote a lot of more political stuff that wasn't necessarily dystopian fiction. The origins of Orwell's preoccupation with surveillance states ruled by an all-seeing political entity or entities very much seems to draw from London's capitalist oligarchy in The Iron Heel. Of course, Orwell combined this with his hatred of Stalinist authoritarianism. Like London, Orwell was a socialist. He also held very strong anarchist sympathies, and one of his primary motivations for writing 1984 was the betrayal of anarchists and other anti-authoritarian communists at the hands of Stalinists, both in Spain and in Russia during the Spanish Civil War. But anyway, for me, The Iron Heel reads quite differently compared to earlier dystopian fiction, and it represents a turning point, I think, in the genre overall. And while it may not contain the most poetic prose, nor particularly multi-dimensional characters, its historical importance, I think, is pretty clear. We can see that from what Orwell has to say about its influence. But overall, when we look at the themes that Jack London looks at in The Iron Heel, it's one that we see over and over in 20th century dystopian fiction, and that we don't really see in 19th century dystopian fiction, for example. So I think the themes that he focuses on really were historically influential and important, which is why I call it the first dystopian, modern dystopian novel. So a little bit more about The Iron Heel going in, because I think some of these things are important to know if you do decide to read it. So even though The Iron Heel is a fictional work technically, it's also very openly a socialist political treatise promoting a workers' revolution against the ruling capitalist establishment. That is important to note because one of the main complaints that I've seen against this book is its literary style. The Iron Heel takes after the literary and philosophical tradition of the Platonic dialogue. It's a literary style with a very long history, of course, dating back to classical Greece, and it has remained popular basically throughout human history until the 20th century, when it starts to fall out of favor. And I think that's one of the main problems a lot of modern readers might have with The Iron Heel, is that it is a fictional work, but because it follows that Platonic style, for some people it can feel a little bit dry and a bit on the nose. So if you've read Plato's Symposium, that's kind of a prime example of the style that I'm talking about. And it's one that's been used, especially by philosophers, political theorists, and theologians for over 2,000 years. And the first half of this novel in particular is framed as a series of fictional political dialogue that's exchanged between a revolutionary socialist, who is the main focus of this book, although he is not the narrator, and capitalist elites. So, like I said, a lot of modern speculative fiction readers don't seem to be fans of this style, especially because of the political motivations being very, very obvious. They were meant to be very, very obvious, and I think, like I said, it can read very on the nose for some people's tastes. So just be aware of that if you do decide to check this out. That said, I think if you're someone who's familiar with or just generally interested in radical leftist theory, or if you're interested in the history of late 18th century American politics more specifically, and early American workers' movements, this is an interesting book to read. And it'll definitely point you in the direction of particular political events, even if they're minor events, and other sources throughout the notes and footnotes. It gives you a lot of context as far as what the American political landscape was looking like at the time, depending on how you read this, of course, and more specifically the workers' movement and the traction that socialism was gaining at the time. I personally enjoyed it for those reasons, but like I said, it depends on you and your interests, I think. Overall, I recommend it with that in mind. So now that there's a little bit of a background, because I do think that this book deserves a bit of a warning, not a warning, but at least a heads up as far as the style of it, because I think that can impact enjoyment and whether it will be beneficial or interesting to you. I'll get into a little bit of what this book is actually about. So, it is written in the form of a fictional, biographical, and also autobiographical account of a revolutionary couple and their participation in an early 20th century socialist uprising in the United States. It's presented as a historical account of events that occurred in the recent past, but we're also told that this fictional historical manuscript is being viewed from people in the very distant future as well. So it's written as a biography / autobiography, but being viewed as a historical manuscript in the distant future. I don't think, if I recall correctly, we're told how distant. So the narrator here is Avis Everhart, the wife of the revolutionary Ernest Everhart. Avis is the upper middle class daughter of an academic, and she is eventually swept off her feet by the rugged Ernest. She tells us the story of how she met Ernest and how she herself became a revolutionary, but her main focus is mostly on telling the story of Ernest, his major role, his greatness, if you will, who he is, his political speeches, discussions, and overall activities, and eventually the events she experiences towards the end of the novel as well. So that's where you get a little bit more of the autobiographical content too. All in all, it's meant to be a tribute to Ernest's life and his deeds, his impact on the workers' movement at the time, with a bit of a sprinkling of Avis's own experiences. So that's the basic premise of this book. What I actually liked about this book is this. I understand why it can be off-putting for a lot of people as far as the literary style, but for me I actually found it worked very well for what it was trying to achieve. Just keeping in mind what this book is meant to be. I think it really depends what you go in looking for. I wasn't really going in looking for a modern novel with intricate plot lines or plot twists or complex characterization, for example. I was reading it predominantly because of my interest in the history of dystopian fiction as a genre, as well as my personal political interests, both from a modern and historical perspective. This wasn't a book with particularly strong characterization or plot lines, but ultimately that wasn't really the point for London or what I personally went in looking for. Like I said, he was essentially using the style of Platonic dialogue to make his points, and I think his characters were really only serving as a means for him to do so. And that's really a change that we start to see after the Iron Heel. As much as the Iron Heel is a turning point for the focus of dystopian fiction as far as the modern surveillance state and seeing a modern political elite or government using that surveillance state against or to oppress its population within the context of, again, a Western democracy. I think those are newer things that he brought to this style or the genre, and definitely influenced things in that way. But where he has his foot in the previous century, I think, is the fact that his characters are just a means of him getting his point across. And when I mean having his foot in the last century, I'm talking mostly with respect to dystopian fiction generally. As far as the birth of modern 20th century dystopias, authors like Zamyatin, Orwell, and Huxley, among others, began modernizing the genre's literary style post Jack London. That said, I think what I enjoyed most about this book and what made it so impactful for me, and one that I continue to think a lot about, was the way he covers specific socialist perspectives in a way that felt very relevant to today's world. Despite being published in 1908, some of these things still felt very fresh to me, and I think very well explained. I also think that the way some of those issues and perspectives were discussed could actually be helpful for people who are still trying to work through certain aspects of socialist theory or political perspectives. I think the way he frames it can be very helpful in that respect. So some of the issues he covers that I'm referring to and that I personally really appreciated were the romanticization of the petite bourgeoisie or small capitalist class, the kind of Ouroboros nature of the small capitalist class, as well as the dangers that romanticization presents to the working class. So in modern times, we can look at the realities of business lobby groups, for example, fighting against minimum wage increases or against paid sick leave for frontline low-wage workers and especially precarious workers, but also the very Ouroboros type situation small capitalists themselves find themselves in. And just to kind of read a quote on that. So this is from one of Ernest's big political speeches or debate nights against the capitalist elites that he attends regularly. So, you, sir, are a poor gamester. When you squeezed out the 3 small grocers in Berkeley, by virtue of your superior combination, you swelled out your chest, talked about efficiency and enterprise, and sent your wife to Europe on the profits you had gained by eating up the 3 small groceries. It is a dog-eat-dog, and you ate them up. But on the other hand, you are being eaten up in turn by the bigger dogs, wherefore you squeal. But when you squeal, you don't state the situation flatly, as I have stated it. You don't say that you like to squeeze profits out of others, that you are making all the row because others are squeezing your profits out of you. No, you are too cunning for that. You say something else. You make small capitalist political speeches, such as Mr. Calvin made. When he says free opportunity for all, he means free opportunity to squeeze profits, which freedom of opportunity is now denied him by the great trusts. And by trusts, they're talking about larger corporations. And the absurd thing about it is that you have repeated these phrases so often that you believe them. You want opportunity to plunder your fellow men in your own small way, but you hypnotize yourselves into thinking you want freedom. You are piggish and acquisitive, but the magic of your phrases leads you to believe that you are patriotic. Your desire for profits, which is sheer selfishness, you metamorphose into altruistic solicitude for suffering humanity. So yeah, I just wanted to read that quote because personally I like it a lot, and I think it describes quite well the kind of, snake serpent eating its tail situation that especially we see small capitalists embrace, or seemingly embrace. Other issues he discusses and that I appreciated include the corruption in the upper echelons of labor unions, the use of nationalism and patriotism in conjunction with militarism as a divisionary tactic against working class movements. And basically at this point, remember that this was written before World War I. At this point, he's actually predicting a portion of the motivations behind World War I, as well as the way nationalism has been used in combination with militarism, kind of a diversionary tactic around the world at this point and today as well, to kind of quash a lot of working class movements which were building momentum, remember, at that time. He also discusses kind of the fundamental, almost inescapable reality of the capitalist democracy, and there I just want to emphasize that I'm saying capitalist democracy, not other forms of democracy, and namely that capitalists in the context of this book would not allow themselves to ever be voted out of power. There's a great quote on that, but I think I've probably read enough of a long quote for today's video. With that, I'll probably head over to what I didn't like about this book. So what I didn't like about it actually relates to what I was saying earlier about characters. Ernest Everhart is a very clear stand-in for Jack London himself. Part of the motivation for this novel was definitely London's own wish fulfillment. He wanted to see himself and to be remembered as a great revolutionary. Ernest is portrayed as extremely intelligent, an expert debater, very eloquent, but also very strong and muscular, generally virile. The best of possible lovers. He is, from London's perspective, the complete package. And if you look into a little bit into Jack London's life, you can see those parallels very quickly as far as where he was in his life at this point in time. Basically, he's placing Avis as the narrator in a way that's meant to reflect positively on Ernest, more specifically. But it's a little bit unfortunate, I thought, because Avis as the narrator had so much more potential that wasn't really fulfilled. Through various passing remarks, we learn about her own contributions to the movement, and actually relating her experiences would have made for a more interesting story, I think, looking especially at the role of a woman within a revolutionary movement at that time. He's kind of framing her as fairly different compared to a lot of contemporary late 18th and early 19th century women protagonists. She actively participates in revolutionary groups. She is portrayed as sexually liberated, supposedly an accomplished spy, and apparently an important part of the movement, but we never really get to see those aspects of her. We just kind of hear about her referring to them in passing, but the story always jumps to Ernest and kind of skims over her involvement. And the other thing too that kind of annoyed me a little bit was when she is kind of dropped into the middle of the action towards the end of the book, she's not really all that impressive. You would think with all the experiences that are hinted at throughout the book that she would have been a little bit more useful, but what can you do? I think London's primary motivations that I was referring to earlier for telling us, for example, about Avis's sexual liberation wind up being very self-serving in the sense that he uses it to emphasize Ernest's sexual prowess, essentially that Avis has slept with all these other strong, smart, important guys, college guys, whatever, but Ernest was, of course, the bestest of all the bestest. So yeah, I think the motivations there for creating a woman protagonist who potentially is quite different from what we're used to seeing at this time has ulterior motives, so to speak. Another character I would have liked to see more of, and that we only really hear in passing, is a character named Anna Royalston, who is apparently based on a friend of London's in life. So what I thought she sounded like quite an interesting character. She was portrayed as, again, an expert spy, an assassin. She's a member of the fighting groups that London talks about. There's more focus on characters like her would have been interesting. The way he handles some of those characters in some ways are ahead of what we more regularly see at the time, but at the same time, from a modern perspective, can leave a lot to be desired and just leaves you thinking that this book could have been so much more than it was. So yeah, like I said, I think if you're already a socialist yourself, or you are interested in socialist theory and politics, I think this book is an interesting read. Even if you aren't, I think if you're interested in the history, more specifically the history of dystopian fiction as a genre, especially with perspective into late 19th century, early 20th century American politics, this is an interesting read. It might send you down some rabbit holes as well, just based on footnotes and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's it for today, and I'll see you next time. And the book I'll be talking about next time is a kind of a similar situation where I've rated it under 4 stars, but it still really stuck with me, and that is The Last Man by Mary Shelley. See you next time.